The summer of 1877 did not end. It rotted. It lingered in the hollows of the Blackwood territory like a sickness, a damp, cloying warmth that refused to give way to the crisp, cleansing hand of autumn. The rains came not as storms, but as a persistent, weeping mist that settled into the very grain of the new-cut logs of the settlers' cabins. The earth, sodden and warm, gave up a strange bounty. It was not a bounty of harvest, for the corn grew mold in the fields, and the potatoes turned to black slush in the ground. It was a bounty of life, but of the wrong kind. It began with the mice. A skittering in the walls that was at first a minor annoyance, the expected price of carving a life from the wilderness. Then came the roaches, slick and dark, emerging from the woodpiles. Spiders spun webs so thick in the corners of cabins that they looked like gray, felted wool. And then came the mites, the weevils, the myriad creeping things that thrived in the damp and the rot. They were an army, a silent, crawling invasion that respected no door and no wall. They were a plague born of a broken season. The cold, when it finally arrived, did not come like a healer. It came like a jailer, locking the settlers in with their tormentors. The first true frost drove the legions of vermin from the dying fields and into the only sources of warmth for miles, the cabins. The problem, once a nuisance, became a crisis. It was a siege from within. The scratching in the walls was no longer a whisper. It was a constant, rasping chorus that frayed the nerves and stole sleep. Weevils turned barrels of precious flour into writhing, gray masses. Mice, grown bold, darted across floors in broad daylight and left their foul droppings on sleeping children's blankets. The community fought back with the tools of their experience. They set traps, dozens of them, which snapped and sprung all night. Yet the tide of vermin never seemed to lessen. The women scrubbed floors with lye until their hands were raw, a desperate, futile act of purification. The men sealed cracks with mud and moss, only to hear new scratching from a different wall the next day. They were practical, hard-working people, and they met the problem with the only virtues they knew: stubbornness and industry. But the plague was not a problem of effort. It was a problem of nature, and their understanding of it was failing them. Their methods were like trying to bail out a flooding river with a thimble. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, having buried her husband on the trail west just a year prior. He had not been a farmer or a woodsman, but a naturalist, a man who carried more books than tools. He had filled journals with detailed notes on botany, on folk remedies, on the old ways of living with the land instead of fighting it. These journals were all Ilara had left of him, besides their 7-year-old son, Leo. She was quiet, seen as fragile by the other settlers, a woman ill-suited for the harsh realities of the frontier. They treated her with a kind of pitying courtesy, offering help she rarely accepted. They did not understand her silence, mistaking her observant nature for timidity. While the others doubled their efforts, Ilara watched. She observed the paths the mice took. She noted which cabins were worst affected. She crumbled the infested flour in her fingers and smelled it, her expression distant and thoughtful. She spent hours walking in the damp woods, not with an axe, but with one of her husband's journals in hand. She looked at the trees, not for their value as lumber or firewood, but for the color of their bark, the shape of their leaves, the smell of their sap. She was searching for an answer, not in action, but in understanding. Then, one morning, the community saw her doing something that made no sense. She walked past the groves of seasoned oak and hickory, the best firewood, the source of clean, hot flames. She carried her husband's small hatchet and went directly to a stand of young, green pine trees, their needles still vibrant, their trunks slick with resin. She began to chop them down. Not the great, mature trees, but the saplings, the ones a proper woodsman would clear as undergrowth and leave to rot. The wood was wet, heavy, and by all accounts, useless for a fire. Silas, the settlement's most respected builder and woodsman, saw her dragging a load of the green limbs back to her cabin. He was a large man, his competence as plain as the calluses on his hands. He stopped her, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Ilara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, as if speaking to a confused child. "That's green pine. It won't burn." "I know," she replied, her voice soft. She did not stop, her small frame straining with the weight of the wood. "It'll do nothing but make smoke," he pressed on, gesturing to the wood as if it were a pile of snakes. "It'll fill your cabin with soot, choke the boy, and give you no heat. The creosote will line your chimney and set the whole place ablaze one day. It's fool's labor." "The smoke is what I want," she said simply, and continued on her way, leaving Silas standing in the muddy track, shaking his head. The word spread through the settlement like a grass fire. The widow had lost her senses. In the midst of a vermin plague, and with a killing winter approaching, she was gathering the worst fuel imaginable. The men laughed as they split their solid, dry oak. "She wants to smoke herself out," one chuckled. "Maybe she thinks she can smoke the mice out, too," another added, and the group erupted in derisive laughter. The women whispered by the communal well. "Poor thing, the grief and the hardship have cracked her." They saw her strange work as a final, sad piece of evidence that she was not fit for this life. The community, united in its struggle, was also united in its judgment of her. She was a fool, and her foolishness was a public spectacle. Ilara heard the whispers. She saw the pitying glances and the smirks. They wounded her, but they did not deter her. Her husband's journals were filled with observations about the properties of resinous woods. He had learned from native tribes he'd met in his travels, who used the smoke of specific plants as medicine, as insect repellent, as a way to preserve hides. He had written, "The modern man sees fire only for its heat. He has forgotten its other language, the language of smoke. Smoke can cleanse, it can preserve, it can drive away what is unseen." The sap of the young pine is not fuel for warmth. It is a weapon against pestilence. She was not acting on a whim. She was acting on knowledge that this community, for all its practical skill, did not possess. So she continued her work, alone and undeterred. Each day she went into the woods and gathered more green pine, but also branches from a specific type of shrub her husband had called bitterwood, known for its acrid, pungent smoke. She did not stack the wood to dry. She laid it on damp cloths near her cabin to keep it fresh and sappy. Her woodpile, a source of pride and a measure of a settler's foresight, became a joke. It was a heap of green, wet branches, a monument to her perceived folly. While her neighbors spent their days in a frantic war against the infestation, Ilara's work was slow and methodical. She was not preparing for a fire. She was preparing for a fumigation. She took clay from the creek bed and painstakingly went over every seam in her small cabin. But she was not sealing it for warmth. She was creating a chamber that she could control. Near the floor, she left 2 small, fist-sized holes on opposite walls, which she could plug with wooden bungs she had carved. At the peak of the roof, near the eaves, she did the same. She was thinking about airflow, about pressure, about how to move smoke through a space and then clear it out again. These were principles of fluid dynamics, learned from a book, not from frontier tradition. Silas, passing by, saw her daubing the clay. "Trying to keep the drafts out?" he asked, his tone betraying his skepticism. "A good fire is the only answer to the cold, Ilara, not mud and green wood." "A good fire doesn't stop what's living in the walls," she answered, without looking up from her work. He shook his head and walked away. He had his own work to do. He was building new, elaborate traps, convinced that a better design was the key. He was applying more force to the problem. The contrast between her methods and the community's grew sharper each day. The other women engaged in a ritual of constant, exhausting cleaning. They swept and scrubbed, boiled their linens, and stored their food in metal tins, yet the contamination continued. One woman, Martha, brewed a tonic of herbs meant to drive away pests. She sprinkled it in her corners, and the only result was that her cabin smelled faintly of mint, and her children sneezed for a week. The vermin were undeterred. The men reinforced their floors and patched their roofs, believing the problem was one of structural integrity. They were fighting the symptoms, while Ilara was preparing to fight the disease itself. She spent one entire afternoon not on her cabin, but on her hearth. She cleaned it meticulously, sweeping out every last ash from the dry oak she had been burning for heat. Then she laid a base of flat stones, creating a slightly raised platform. On top of this, she placed a thick layer of damp moss. This was not a bed for a fire that would produce heat, but for one that would smolder, that would burn as slowly and inefficiently as possible. Her every action was a contradiction of common knowledge. To build a fire, one needed dry tinder, good airflow from below, and seasoned hardwood. Ilara was preparing a foundation of wet moss, planning to use wet wood, and sealing her cabin to restrict airflow. It was the exact opposite of everything a sane settler would do. Leo, her son, watched her with the unquestioning faith of a child. "Why are you making the house so tight, Mama?" he asked, his small hands pressing against the new clay. "We have unwelcome guests," she told him, her voice calm and reassuring. "We have to ask them to leave, but they don't speak our language. We have to speak theirs." He didn't understand, but he trusted her. His trust was a small, warm shield against the cold judgment of the rest of the settlement. The final piece of her preparation was a small bundle of dried lavender and chamomile, wrapped in a piece of cloth. This was for her and Leo. Her husband's journal noted that while the pine smoke was a harsh irritant to pests, the scent of these herbs could help soothe the lungs of humans and mask the worst of the acrid smell. She was not just building a weapon, she was planning for how to live alongside it during the battle. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, the crisis in the settlement reached its breaking point. A week of relentless, freezing rain gave way to a sudden, brutal cold snap. The temperature plummeted. The ground, once soft and muddy, became as hard as iron overnight. This was the final catalyst. Every creature that had been clinging to a desperate existence in the half-frozen fields now made a final, frantic push for the warmth of the cabins. The siege became an occupation. The sounds from the walls became a deafening, scratching roar. Mice, no longer content with crumbs, gnawed through leather harnesses and chewed the bindings of books. Roaches swarmed from the woodpiles in black, undulating carpets. In Silas's home, his wife Mary awoke screaming. A rat had crawled into the cradle of their infant daughter. Silas killed it with a fireplace shovel, his hands shaking with rage and fear. The sanctity of their homes was gone. They were no longer shelters, they were nests. Sickness followed. A fever swept through the settlement, carried, the people whispered, by the filth of the vermin. Children were the first to fall ill, their small bodies racked with coughs and chills. The community's spirit, already frayed, began to tear. Tempers grew short. The men argued over dwindling resources. The women wept in exhaustion and despair. Their traditional methods had not just failed, they had been utterly vanquished. They were defeated, living in squalor, watching their children suffer, with the endless, maddening sound of scratching as a constant reminder of their powerlessness. It was on the third day of the hard frost, that Alara decided it was time. The air in her own cabin was thick with the smell of mouse musk. That morning, she had found a nest of them in her own small sack of beans. It was the final violation. She looked at Leo, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He was starting to cough. The time for preparation was over. The time for the purge had come. She took Leo, wrapped him in her thickest shawl, and carried him to the cabin of her nearest neighbor, Martha. "Can you watch him for the afternoon?" she asked. "I need to clean my house." Martha looked at her with pity. "Cleaning won't help, Alara. I've scrubbed my floors raw. They always come back." "This is a different kind of cleaning," Alara said. She handed Leo a small cloth bundle. "Hold this to your nose if you start to cough," she whispered. And in the bundle was the lavender and chamomile. She did not want to expose him to the thickest of the smoke. Martha, preoccupied with her own sick child, simply nodded and took him in. Alara walked back to her cabin, her steps purposeful. The sky was a low, bruised gray. The wind was sharp, like a knife. She entered her home and took a moment to survey the small space. It was her sanctuary, and it had been defiled. She took a deep breath, and then she began. She plugged all but one of the lower vents she had made. She laid her collection of green pine and bitterwood branches on the bed of damp moss in her hearth. She did not use tinder. Instead, she took a few glowing coals from the small fire she had kept for warmth and buried them deep within the wettest, most resinous pine logs. It was a struggle. The coals hissed and steamed, threatening to go out. This was the most delicate part. She had to nurture a smolder, not a flame. She blew gently, not to ignite the wood, but to encourage a slow, creeping burn deep within the pile. For nearly an hour, it seemed like nothing was happening. Then, a thin, greasy-looking smoke began to curl from the wood. It was not the clean, white smoke of a proper fire. It was a thick, yellow-gray smoke, heavy and pungent. It smelled of raw pine sap and something else, something acrid and bitter. It did not rise quickly up the chimney. Instead, it hugged the floor, a slow-moving fog that began to fill the cabin from the bottom up. Alara worked quickly now. She checked her vents, ensuring only a tiny amount of air was coming in from the one she'd left open, just enough to feed the smolder without letting it erupt into flame. The smoke thickened, the air growing hazy and difficult to breathe. She tied a damp cloth over her own nose and mouth. She watched, her eyes burning, as the smoke level rose. It was working. The smolder was holding. The green wood was not burning. It was baking, releasing all its volatile oils into the air. The cabin was becoming a smokehouse, a purification chamber. Outside, the neighbors watched. The smoke was not billowing from her chimney in a healthy plume. It was leaking from the eaves, from the cracks around her door and window, from the very seams of the logs. It looked as if the cabin itself was sweating a foul, yellow haze. "She's done it now," Silas said to the man next to him. "She'll burn the place down or die of choke damp." They stood there, a small, grim audience, waiting for the disaster they had all predicted. They were not malicious. They were simply certain they were right. They were waiting for the proof of her folly. And then they saw it. It started as a trickle, then became a flood. From the base of her cabin, from the tiny gaps between the foundation stones and the first logs, a tide of living things began to pour out. Mice, dozens of them, then hundreds, streamed out, their eyes wide with panic. They were not scurrying. They were fleeing for their lives, tumbling over one another in a desperate exodus. They were joined by an army of roaches, spiders, beetles, and every other crawling thing that had taken refuge in the walls. It was as if the cabin was vomiting out its own infestation. The ground around Alara's home became a writhing carpet of vermin, disoriented by the smoke, gasping in the clean, cold air. They fled a few feet and then shuddered, slowed, and died. The settlers stood in stunned, absolute silence. The laughter was gone. The pity was gone. All that remained was a profound, world-altering shock. They were not witnessing an act of folly. They were witnessing a miracle. They had been fighting a war of attrition, one trap, one swipe of a broom at a time. Elara had unleashed a weapon of mass destruction. After an hour, the flood of escaping pests slowed to a trickle, and then stopped. The smoke still leaked from the seams of the cabin. Elara, her face smudged with soot, emerged. She calmly walked to the other side of the cabin, unplugged the other lower vent, and then went to the two vents she had made high in the eaves and opened them. A draft began to move through the cabin, pulling the dense smoke upwards and out. She stood outside, breathing the cold, fresh air, and waited for her house to clear. She did not look at the crowd of onlookers. She did not have to. She could feel their stares. Silas was the first to move. He walked slowly, as if in a dream, toward her cabin. He had to step over the twitching bodies of hundreds of dead mice. The smell of pine smoke was overwhelming, but underneath it, there was something else. The smell of clean wood, of a space that had been purged. He stopped at her open door and peered inside. The air was still hazy, but he could see the floor. It was littered with the bodies of the pests that hadn't made it out, but it was otherwise clean. There was no scurrying in the corners. There was no sound from the walls. There was only silence. A profound, peaceful, and absolute silence. He looked back at his own cabin, 100 yards away. He couldn't see the filth, but he could feel it. He could hear the scratching in his mind. He knew his wife was in there, sick, in a bed where vermin nested in the straw mattress. The contrast between that defiled space and this clean, quiet one was a physical blow. He had been so sure of his own knowledge, of the community's collective wisdom. He had laughed at her. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating thought. He was wrong. Elara returned from Martha's cabin with Leo in her arms. She walked past the silent crowd, past the carpet of dead creatures, and into her home. She did not say a word. She did not have to. The evidence of her vindication was all around them. She simply began the task of sweeping the dead pests out of her home and into a pile to be burned. It was a quiet, methodical act. There was no triumph in her posture, no hint of gloating. There was only the quiet competence of a person who had seen a problem, found a solution, and enacted it. Her victory was as quiet as her work had been. That evening, as the last of the foul smoke cleared from her cabin, leaving behind only a clean, sharp scent of pine, Silas appeared at her door. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. His face, usually so confident, was etched with desperation and humility. "My Mary," he began, his voice cracking, "the fever is worse. The rats, they are in her bedding. We can't get them out. I can't lose her, Elara." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. The most respected man in the settlement was asking for help from the woman they had all called a fool. "Teach me," he said, the words barely a whisper. "Please, teach me what you did." Elara looked at him, and then past him to his dark, troubled cabin. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but a husband afraid for his wife. She nodded slowly. "Get your family out of the house," she said, her voice even and calm. "Take them to a neighbor, and then come back. We will need more green wood." Word of Silas's capitulation spread faster than the story of the exodus of pests. It was one thing to see the proof with their own eyes. It was another for their strongest, most stubborn leader to admit his defeat and ask for her guidance. One by one, Then, in small groups, other settlers began to appear at her cabin. They did not come to mock, they came to see. They peered into her clean pantry, where her sacks of flour and cornmeal sat untouched. They listened to the profound silence in her walls. They saw Leo sleeping peacefully in his cot, for the first time in months, not scratching at phantom itches. The laughter was gone forever, replaced by a murmuring awe. They looked at the pile of green pine branches with new eyes. It was no longer a sign of foolishness. It was an arsenal. They looked at Ilara, this quiet widow they had pitied, and saw a wisdom they could not comprehend. She shared her knowledge freely. She did not hoard it or ask for payment. When Silas returned, she walked with him into the woods. She didn't just tell him to cut pine. She showed him how to identify the youngest, most resinous trees. "The strength is in the sap," she explained, showing him the sticky fluid that beaded on the axe blade. "It's the lifeblood of the tree. The pests can't abide it." She went to his cabin and directed the work. She showed him how to seal the walls, not perfectly but strategically, to control the flow of smoke. She explained the principle of the smolder, how to create a slow, oxygen-starved fire that would release the oils instead of just burning them away. She taught him to read the smoke, to know by its color and density if the smolder was right. The men who had laughed at her now worked under her direction, their mockery replaced by a focused, desperate attention. They hauled the green wood, they mixed the clay, they followed her instructions to the letter. That night, a second column of thick yellow smoke rose into the twilight sky, this time from Silas's cabin. And once again, the settlement watched as a tide of vermin poured from the foundation, fleeing the pungent, inescapable cloud. The next day, Silas's house was silent. Mary's fever, tended to in a clean, pest-free environment at a neighbor's, began to break. The relief on Silas's face was a more powerful testimony than any words. He became her most devoted student and her most vocal advocate. He went to the other settlers. "We have been fools," he announced at a gathering by the well. "We trusted our own stubbornness over a wisdom we didn't understand. We laughed, and she was right. Now we learn, or we let this plague destroy us." A new kind of work began in the settlement. It was a communal, systematic purge. House by house, the settlers, led by Ilara and a now humbled Silas, performed the smoke ritual. Each family would move in with a neighbor for a day while their home was cleansed. The air in the settlement was thick with the scent of pine for a week, a smell that had once been a joke, but was now the fragrance of their salvation. The piles of dead vermin grew and were burned in a great cleansing pyre at the edge of the settlement. With the infestation gone, the sickness began to recede. The constant, nerve-shredding sound of scratching was replaced by peace. Sleep returned. Food could be stored without fear of contamination. The settlement, which had been on the brink of collapse, was saved. The people had been fighting a physical battle, but the solution had come from a place of knowledge and observation. In the spring, the practice was formalized. It became known as the Green Smoke Purge, a ritual to be performed each autumn before the first hard frost, a way to cleanse the homes and prepare for the winter. Ilara, once the outcast, became the most respected person in the community. She was no longer the poor widow. She was Ilara, the wise woman. They came to her not just for advice on the smoke, but for other things too. They brought her sick children, their blighted plants, their questions about the land. She would often consult her husband's journals, her quiet voice sharing a knowledge that had been waiting patiently to be heard. The story of the settlement that saved itself with green wood traveled. A traveling preacher, stopping for a night, was amazed by the cleanliness and health of the community, especially after hearing tales of plague in other new territories. He carried the story with him, preaching it as a parable of humility and strange providence. A government surveyor mapping the territory noted the unusual practice in his official report, describing the annual fumigation with coniferous smoke that kept the settlement remarkably free of disease. The idea spread, slowly, quietly, carried in letters and by word of mouth. It became a piece of frontier wisdom, passed from one desperate settlement to another. The knowledge saved countless lives, prevented famines, and eased the immense hardship of taming a new land. Few knew the name of the quiet widow who had first defied convention, but her legacy was written in the plumes of pungent smoke that rose from cabins across the territory each fall. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a proper town with a church and a general store, Silas would often sit with his grandchildren on his porch and tell them the story. He never failed to mention his own foolishness, his own pride. "We thought we knew everything there was to know about an axe and a log," he would say, his voice thick with the memory. "We looked at her and saw a weak woman. We didn't see the strength of her mind. We heard her strange idea and we laughed. But the land doesn't care about our pride. It doesn't care about our traditions. It only cares about what works." The final lesson was not about smoke or pine trees, or even about survival. It was about wisdom. It was the realization that true knowledge is often quiet, unassuming, and found in the places one is least likely to look. It is the understanding that the most dangerous pest is not the one that scurries in the walls, but the pride that closes the mind to a new idea. The smoke, which had once been a symbol of foolishness, had become the enduring scent of their humility, a pungent reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply stop, watch, and listen to a voice that everyone else has dismissed. Ilara had taught them more than how to clean a house. She had taught them how to learn.